My name is Raymond Calder, and on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, I found an envelope that had been slid under the door of a room I built with my own two hands. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I do not mean built in the way people sometimes say it when they hire someone and stand back and watch. I mean I drove every nail. I laid every course of brick on that back wall through 3 Oklahoma summers. I ran the electrical through the walls of that bedroom on a February night when it was 23 degrees in the crawl space, and my knees had not yet started giving me trouble the way they do now. I built that room the same way I built everything in that house, which is to say the same way I built everything in my life, which is to say slowly, carefully, and with more of myself in it than most people would consider reasonable. The envelope was white, plain, the kind you buy in a box of 100 from a drugstore. It had been folded once and pushed through the gap at the bottom of the door, and it was sitting there on the linoleum floor when I came back from the bathroom at 6:30 in the morning. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment before I picked it up. I already knew it was not good news. A man who has lived long enough develops a particular sensitivity to the atmosphere of a room when something in it has changed while he was not looking. And that envelope on the floor of my own house changed the atmosphere of that room the way a crack changes the atmosphere of a load-bearing wall. You see it, and you know. You do not always know exactly what it means yet, but you know it means something you are going to have to deal with. I picked it up. I opened it. I read what was inside. It was a printed piece of paper, not handwritten. Printed on a computer, the font plain and businesslike, the margin standard, the language stripped of anything that might be confused with sentiment. At the top it said, "Room rent." Below that it said, "Back bedroom." Below that it said, "Due Friday." At the bottom, in handwriting I had recognized since the 3rd grade, my son Grant had added a note. "Pay or move out by Friday, Dad. Nobody lives here for free." I read it twice. Then I folded the paper back into the envelope and sat down on the edge of the bed that I had purchased for $32 at an estate sale in Sand Springs 17 years ago. A bed that had been in the back bedroom as long as the back bedroom had existed, and I sat there without moving for what was probably 4 or 5 minutes, though it felt considerably longer than that. Outside the window I could hear the Tulsa morning beginning. A dog somewhere down Yorktown Avenue. A truck pulling out of a driveway 2 houses up. The particular way October air sounds in Oklahoma when the summer has finally broken and the trees are deciding whether or not to let go of their leaves. I have lived on that street for 31 years, and I know every sound it makes at every hour of the day, and the sounds were all exactly correct that morning. Everything outside was normal. Everything inside the envelope was not. I want to stop here for just a moment, because I am sitting here telling you this story and I realize I have been carrying the weight of it for long enough that I almost forgot how much heavier it gets when you put it into words. Where are you right now? What city are you in? What state? Put it in the comments because I want to know who is out there with me on a morning like this one. And if it is late where you are, if you found this when you could not sleep, I understand that better than you probably realize. Leave a like if what I am telling you is landing somewhere real. Subscribe because there is a new story here every day, and I have a feeling some of them are going to matter to you the same way this one matters to me. Now let me keep going, because the story starts a long way before that Tuesday morning. My wife Laurel used to say that a house is not a building. It is a record of every decision a person ever made. She would say this while we were working, usually. Not in a philosophical way, not sitting in a chair with a cup of tea and a distant look. She would say it while she was measuring something or holding a board while I cut it. Practical and present the way she was about everything. She meant it, literally. Every decision is in the walls, she would say. Every shortcut you did not take. Every corner you did right even when no one would ever see it. We started building the house at 2148 South Yorktown Avenue in the spring of 1993. Grant was 5 years old. Elaine, my sister, was living in a rental in the Pearl District and thought we were slightly out of our minds. Our budget was tight enough to make most people uncomfortable. Our lot was a stripped piece of land that a previous owner had let go to gravel and hard clay. and the foundation work alone took us the better part of a year because we could only afford to hire professionals for certain specific stages, and I had to do the rest myself during the hours between my shifts at Western Electrical Services and the hours of actual sleep that a man needs to keep functioning. I was 27 years old that spring. I weighed 182 pounds. My hands were already developing the particular thickness that comes from sustained physical work, and Laurel used to hold them at the end of a long day and trace the calluses the way other people trace a map, slowly and with attention, like she was reading something written there that not everyone could see. Calvin Brooks was the one who taught me the brickwork. He was in his mid-30s then, already 20 years into the masonry trade that his father had taught him, and he lived 4 blocks over on Hudson Avenue. We met through the church, and he became the kind of friend that a man is lucky to find once in a life. Not a friend who tells you things you want to hear. A friend who shows up on a Saturday morning in old clothes and says, "What are we doing today?" and rolls up his sleeves and does it, without complaint, without making you feel the weight of the favor. Calvin taught me how to read a course of brick. He taught me how to mix mortar in Oklahoma heat, which is different from mixing it anywhere else because the heat pulls the moisture out faster than you expect, and if you are not paying attention, the mortar goes stiff before you are finished with it, and then you are in trouble. He taught me how to check for plumb and for level, and he taught me why those two things matter, not just for the wall you are building now, but for every wall that comes after it. The back bedroom was one of the last things I finished. We had been in the house for 4 years by then, living with the back section framed but not completed, and I finally got the back bedroom done in the summer of 1997. Grant was 9 years old. He came out to the backyard that last Saturday afternoon when I was laying the final course of brick on the exterior wall of that room, and he sat on an overturned bucket and watched me work for about 20 minutes without saying anything, which was unusual for him at that age. Then he said, "Dad, how long does it take to learn how to do that?" I told him as long as you need, which was the honest answer. He nodded and went back inside, and I finished the wall and came in and washed up for dinner, and that was that. He never asked again. Now let me tell you how I ended up sleeping in that room 30 years later. Laurel died in the spring of the year before last. I will not say much about that part of the story, not because it does not matter, because it matters more than anything else I could tell you, but because some griefs are too private to be explained and too large to be contained in the kind of words that do them justice. What I will tell you is that she was ill for 9 months, that she was steady and kind throughout those 9 months in the way she was steady and kind throughout everything, and that the house on Yorktown Avenue felt completely different after she was gone. Not smaller, not emptier in the way that word usually means, just different. As if the building itself was aware of the change and had not yet decided what to do about it. I was not handling things well. I want to be honest about that. I was functional, in the technical sense that I went to the grocery store and paid the utility bills and answered the phone when it rang. But there were days when I would sit at the kitchen table, the same table Laurel had found at a garage sale in 1991, the one with the slight warp in the fourth board from the left edge that she always said gave it character, and I would sit there for an hour without accomplishing anything or wanting to accomplish anything or being fully aware of how much time was passing. Grant started coming around more frequently. Marissa, too. They would bring meals occasionally, and they would check on the yard, and they would sit with me in the living room and watch whatever was on television without requiring me to be entertaining. In those early months I was grateful for this. Grief isolates a person in ways that are difficult to describe from the inside, and having people in the house, even quietly, even doing nothing much, helped in ways I could not have specified if asked. It was during this period that Grant first raised the idea of the administrative arrangement. He came to me on a Sunday afternoon in late summer. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, and he laid it out in the practical, organized way that he has always approached financial matters, with a list and a clear sequence and a tone that suggested he had already thought through the objections. The gist of it was this. The house was now in the name of a single individual, myself, a widower, with no automatic mechanism for managing expenses or decisions in the event of his incapacity or absence. He had spoken to an accountant, he said, who had recommended creating what he called a family administrative structure. which would allow Grant to manage contracts, handle correspondence related to the property, authorize routine maintenance and repair expenditures, and ensure that nothing fell through the cracks the way things sometimes do when a house is managed by a person who is, as Grant put it, going through a significant adjustment period. He was careful with the words. He always has been. There is something in the way Grant handles language that reminds me of a contractor who uses just enough material to hold the thing up without putting any more into it than necessary. Efficient. Precise. The warmth stripped out of the vocabulary, the same way you strip a wire before you connect it. I want to be direct about something. I knew the house. I knew every system in it. I had replaced the hot water heater twice and the HVAC unit once. I knew which faucet needed the washer replaced every 18 months and which circuit breaker ran which part of the house. I was not incapable of managing it. What I was tired in a specific way that is hard to explain to someone who has not experienced it. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been the one holding things together for 30 years and who has just lost the other person who made that worthwhile, and Grant knew this and knew it was the right moment to ask. I said yes to more of it than I should have. I thought I was agreeing to let him handle some paperwork, some correspondence, some of the logistical burden that had accumulated. I told him explicitly, and I want you to understand that I remember this clearly, I told him that the house was still mine, that I was not transferring ownership of anything, and that this was a practical arrangement to reduce the workload of a man who was temporarily not at full capacity. He agreed. He said, of course. He said nobody is suggesting anything else. In the months that followed, the changes came the way water erodes stone, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily and in small amounts that do not seem significant while they are happening. The first lock set he changed was on the front door. He said the existing one was a security risk, which was technically true. The hardware was 20 years old. He had a key made for himself and Marissa and left me the original key plus a spare. And at the time I did not think much of it. The second lock set was on the workshop at the side of the house, which I had always kept unlocked because I was in and out of it constantly. He said he wanted to ensure nobody could access the tools without authorization. I pointed out that the only person accessing the tools was me. He said it was just good practice. I let it go. By early the following year, the cable and internet accounts had been moved to Grant's email. The landscape maintenance service that had been billing me directly for 6 years was now billing Grant's account. He said it was easier to track everything in one place, which was logically coherent, which is the thing about Grant's explanations. They are always logically coherent. They are coherent the way a fence is coherent, meaning they keep you from going somewhere without necessarily being honest about why. Grant and Marissa moved into the master bedroom in February. The explanation was that their apartment lease was expiring, and they wanted to be on hand in case I needed help, and they would find something else within 3 to 4 months once they had identified the right place. The right place never materialized. I moved into the back bedroom in March, temporarily, to give them more space, which is what I told myself as much as I told them. Temporarily. That word again. I have learned since then that temporarily means different things to different people, and that when someone else uses it, it is worth asking them to put a date on it. By the time Calvin Brooks came by for coffee on a Thursday afternoon in July and looked around the kitchen and looked at me and said, "Raymond, are you a guest in your own home now?" The answer was functionally yes, though neither of us used that word. I told him family sometimes needs extra room. He looked at me for a long moment, the way he has always looked at me when he thinks I am not being straight with myself, that particular steady look of a man who helped lay the foundation of your house and therefore feels he has certain rights regarding its structural integrity. Then he drank his coffee and did not push me further and left me to think about it, which was maybe the kindest thing he could have done. What Calvin did not know, and what I did not fully understand myself until the Tuesday morning with the envelope, was that I had not simply allowed Grant to be generous with space and time and management. I had allowed him to reframe the house until the framing fit his purposes more than mine. And somewhere in that gradual reframing, I had stopped walking through my own home the way a man walks through a place that belongs to him. I started asking whether the living room was being used before I sat down in it. I started keeping my coffee in a cabinet in the back bedroom rather than in the kitchen cabinet I had used for 12 years. I started waiting to hear whether anyone else was home before I turned on the television in the room where the television had always been. I did these things without entirely deciding to do them. That is the particular genius of the slow erosion. You do not notice you are accommodating until you look up one day and see how far you have moved from where you started. It was Marissa who first said I needed to understand limits. She used that phrase specifically. We were in the kitchen and I had come in to refill my coffee without apparently having said anything to anyone first, and she explained, not unkindly but not warmly either, that now that the house had a different administrative structure, it was important for everyone to understand their roles and maintain appropriate boundaries. She said appropriate boundaries in my kitchen, in the room where the fourth board from the left edge of the table still has a slight warp in it, in the room where Laurel made coffee every morning for 29 years. I said I understood. I refilled my cup and went back to the room in the back of the house and closed the door and stood at the window that looks out over the yard where the tool shed is, and breathed for a while. That was 3 months before the envelope appeared under the door. Now stay with me here because I need to tell you what I did on that Friday when the rent came due. Because the Friday is the whole story. The Friday is the reason any of the rest of this matters. I have been an electrician for most of my working life, which means I have spent 30 years thinking about systems, about how power moves through a structure, about where the load goes and what happens when the path is interrupted, about the difference between a circuit that works and a circuit that merely appears to work because the problem is buried deep enough that you have to open the wall to find it. I think about things in those terms still, even now that I am mostly retired. I cannot help it. When something goes wrong in a human situation, my instinct is to trace the wire back to the source, to find the original decision or the original flaw in the design, the place where the load exceeded the capacity and the damage began. The original decision in my situation traced back further than Grant. It traced back to me. I want to be honest about this because the story is not useful to anyone if I tell it in a way that makes me blameless. I was not blameless. I was a man who was grieving, and grief made me passive in ways that I have not been at any other time in my life, and passivity in a situation that requires resistance is a form of participation in whatever happens next. When Grant first described the administrative arrangement to me at that kitchen table in late summer, I had the instincts that a man with my experience should have had. Something in me registered the efficient precision of his language. Something in me noticed that he had already consulted an accountant before having the conversation with me, which meant the conversation was not an opening for my input, but a presentation of something already decided. I noticed these things. I let them go anyway, because I was tired and because Grant was my son, and because Laurel had been gone for 4 months and I did not have the capacity to hold a position against someone I loved. Grief is not an excuse. It is a context. The context does not change what happened, but it belongs in the story because without it, the story does not make sense. Grant Calder is not a villain. I want to make that clear before I describe what he did, because I have had enough time now to understand the difference between a person who is consciously malicious and a person who has simply never been required to ask whether what they want is also what is right. Grant grew up comfortable. He grew up in a house that was always being built, always being improved, always getting better, and the work that produced that improvement was largely invisible to him, because it happened at hours when he was asleep or at school, or simply not paying the kind of attention that would have made it visible. He saw the results. He did not see the process. And a man who sees only results eventually starts to believe that results are what matters, that the process is incidental, that whoever holds the paperwork holds the thing the paperwork describes. His mother understood this about him. Laurel saw it more clearly than I did, probably because she watched him more carefully than I did, the way mothers sometimes watch the things that fathers take for granted. She loved Grant with everything she had, and she was not blind to who he was. This is the part of the story where I have to tell you about a conversation I did not know I would need to remember for the rest of my life. It was 3 years before she died. We were sitting on the back porch in the September evening, the porch I had rebuilt in the summer of 2009 when the original boards finally rotted through. And we had finished dinner, and we were just sitting in that easy way that 30 years of marriage makes available to you, not needing to fill the silence with anything. Laurel was looking out at the tool shed, and she said something that I let pass over me at the time because I did not understand why she was saying it, only that she was. She said, "Raymond, you are the most generous man I have ever known in my life." She said it the way she said other true things, simply and directly, without preamble. And then she said, "And that is the thing I am most proud of about you, and the thing that worries me most about you at the same time." I asked her what she meant. She said the kind of generosity that builds a house from nothing is the same kind of generosity that lets a person walk through the door and call it their own without understanding what it cost. She said she had watched me give pieces of myself my whole life, and she had seen the people who received those pieces, and she had noticed that not all of them knew what they were receiving. I told her she was being pessimistic. She told me she was being accurate. "There is a difference," she said. 3 weeks after that conversation, she went to see Joanne Whitaker. Now let me tell you who Joanne Whitaker is, because Joanne is a part of this story that I did not know about until long after everything that happened had already happened, which means Laurel built something into the foundation of our situation that I was not even aware of. The same way she used to hide small things in the walls of the house during construction, a coin here, a note there, things that would only be found by someone doing serious renovation work, things she put there for reasons that were entirely her own. Joanne Whitaker has been a records and property consultant in Tulsa for more than 20 years. She is not a lawyer, though she works with lawyers regularly. She is the kind of professional who knows the documents, knows the language, knows what things mean in practice versus what they appear to mean on the surface. Laurel had known her through the neighborhood association for years. They were the kind of acquaintances who knew each other's names and occupations and would have a real conversation if they ended up in the same room, but who did not socialize regularly. Laurel called her out of the blue on a Wednesday morning and asked if she could come in. What Joanne told me later, and she told me this in the same practical tone she uses for everything, is that Laurel came in and sat down and said she had a specific situation she wanted to address before it became a problem. She said she had a husband who was generous to the point of self-sacrifice and a son who was competent and well-intentioned and not particularly good at understanding the value of things that had not cost him anything. She said she wanted to create a document that protected the first one from the second one without making either of them feel like they were being handled. What Joanne prepared, over 2 meetings in the fall of that year, was a document that Laurel called the Family Occupancy Covenant. It was not a complex legal instrument. It did not redefine ownership or create a trust or involve attorneys or require recording with the county. It was a witnessed agreement, signed by Laurel, signed by Joanne as the preparer, and notarized, that established certain conditions under which any family member could be granted administrative authority over the property at 2148 South Yorktown Avenue. The conditions were specific and sensible. A family member, meaning Grant, could be authorized by Raymond to manage repair contracts, utility accounts, routine maintenance expenditures, and correspondence related to the property. This authorization was revocable at Raymond's discretion. This authorization did not constitute any form of ownership interest, partial or complete, and under no circumstances whatsoever, not as rent, not as administrative fees, not under any other description or framing, could a family member authorized under this agreement charge Raymond Calder any monetary amount for the use of any room or portion of the property. If any authorized family member charged or attempted to charge Raymond Calder rent for any room or portion of his own property, and if any documentation of that charge was signed by either party, the administrative authorization was automatically and immediately revoked, and all administrative responsibilities would transfer to Elaine Porter, Raymond's sister, pending Raymond's designation of a different arrangement. Laurel signed this document 3 years before she died and put it in the hands of Joanne Whitaker for safekeeping. She never told me it existed. I want you to sit with that for a moment. My wife, 3 years before she left, looked at the life we had built, and the people in it, and the particular quality of my heart which she knew better than I know it myself. And she built a safety net I did not know I was going to need. Now, let me drop down for a moment and tell you something before I go any further with this, because I have been carrying this story for a while and saying it out loud does something to me that I was not entirely prepared for. If you are still with me right now, if you have been listening from the beginning, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? What city? What state? Drop it in the comments and tell me. I want to know who is out there with an old electrician from Tulsa on a night like this. And if someone came to mind while I was talking about Laurel, if this story made you think of someone you loved who was smarter about protecting you than you knew, leave a comment and tell me about that too. Hit the like button if this is hitting you somewhere real. Subscribe if you want to hear what happens next, because there is a new story here every single day. And this one is not over, not by a long way. Now, let me keep going. Laurel kept the document from me for a specific reason that Joanne explained to me later. She said Laurel believed that if I knew about it, I would find a way to undo it. Not because I wanted to be unprotected, but because I would worry that having it meant I was suspicious of Grant. And being suspicious of Grant would make me feel like a bad father. And feeling like a bad father would make me sad in a way that I did not deserve to be made sad. So she protected the document from me the same way she protected me from 100 other things over 30 years, by simply handling it and not troubling me with it until the handling became necessary. I miss her every single day. I want you to know that. Not in a way that paralyzes me anymore, but in the steady, constant way that a house settles into its foundation over the years, which is to say permanently and completely, and without any possibility of removing it. Now, the months between the administrative arrangement and the Tuesday with the envelope, I need to describe certain things accurately because the accurate description matters for understanding how a situation like this one unfolds. It does not unfold all at once. It unfolds in increments that are each individually small enough to excuse, and the excuse is always available, and the excuse always has the sound of logic. Grant changed the schedule for the yard service without telling me. Then he scheduled a plumber to look at the kitchen sink without telling me, and was irritated when I did not know the appointment had been made, and answered the door in my work clothes. He had the exterior painted in April, which needed doing, but he chose the color without asking me and did not consult me on the contractor, and the color is not the color Laurel and I had discussed when we last talked about painting it. It is a fine color. It is not our color. He created an email account for property-related correspondence and began forwarding everything there. I asked for access to the account, and he sent me read-only access, which means I could see the correspondence but could not reply to it, which meant that anyone corresponding about my property was corresponding with Grant, not with me. He converted the room that had been Laurel's small office, the room she used for her reading and her correspondence, and the particular kind of quiet that a woman who lives with a man and raises a son and keeps a house together needs somewhere to maintain, into his own home office. He asked before he did this. I said yes without thinking it through, because I was still in the period where I was trying not to occupy too much of my own grief in front of people who seemed to need me to be more functional than I was. If I had thought it through, I would have said no. Not because I needed the room, because the room was Laurel's and taking it over felt like something I did not have the authority to authorize for him. But I said yes, and Grant installed his desk and his equipment and his filing system in there, and Laurel's books were boxed and moved to the storage area in the basement. I have not been able to open those boxes since. That is not something I have told anyone until right now. Marissa redecorated the living room, not dramatically, just pillows and a new rug and some things rearranged. The room looks fine. It looks like it belongs to someone else. I want to be fair to Marissa because the story requires fairness to make sense. She is not malicious. She is a woman who moved into a house and arranged it the way people who live in a house arrange it, according to their own sense of what looks right. She did not know whose sense of what looked right had already been in that room for 30 years. She did not know which pillow had been where for a decade, and why. She would have had to ask, and she did not ask, and I did not tell her. By July, I was eating most of my meals in the back bedroom. By August, I was keeping my schedule around when they were home versus when they were not. By September, I had developed a habit of listening for sounds in the house before I came into the main area. The way you develop any habit that keeps a thing that makes you uncomfortable from being uncomfortable, which is to say unconsciously and gradually, and without noticing what the habit is doing to your sense of who you are in a place. Calvin came over that Thursday in July and saw it. He is 67 years old, and he has been reading situations his entire life, and he read this one in about 4 minutes, and he asked his question, and I gave him my answer, and we both knew the answer was not true. What I did not tell Calvin that afternoon, what I had not told anyone, was that I had started going to the tool shed at night, not to do anything in particular, just to sit there. The tool shed at the side of the house is my space in a way that the house itself had ceased to be. It is full of my tools and my smell and the particular organization of a man who knows exactly where everything is because he put it there himself. It smells like sawdust and machine oil and rubber and the particular metallic smell of old electrical wire, and it sounds like the Oklahoma night coming through the single window on the north wall, crickets and distant traffic and sometimes rain on the corrugated roof. I would sit on the old stool in the corner and not do anything much and breathe, and after a while I would go back into the house and go to bed. It was in the tool shed one night in September, sitting on that stool, that I made the decision that changed everything. Not a dramatic decision. Not a plan with steps and a timeline. Just the particular settling of a mind that has been troubled for long enough and has finally found the still place beneath the trouble. I decided I was going to find out exactly what I had agreed to. I decided I was going to read every document I had signed. I decided I was going to understand, precisely and completely, what the administrative arrangement meant in legal and practical terms. And I decided that if there was a path back to being the owner of my own home rather than a tenant in the back bedroom, I was going to find it and walk it. I did not know yet about the covenant. I did not know yet about Joanne Whitaker. I did not know yet that Laurel had already built the path and left it for me. I just knew it was time to stop accommodating and start understanding. And I knew, with the particular certainty of a man who has been an electrician for 30 years, that when you take the time to trace a wire all the way back to its source, you almost always find that the problem is not where you thought it was. The following weeks were quiet from the outside. I went about my routines. I had coffee in the morning. I took my walks along Yorktown in the early afternoon when the light is flat and the neighborhood is mostly empty. I visited Laurel's grave on the first Sunday of each month, the way I have done since the spring before last, and I sat with her for a while and told her what was happening in the way I tell her things now, which is to say quietly and in my own mind, trusting that somehow the communication arrives. I also spent time in the evenings going carefully through every document I could find related to the house. My personal records were in the filing cabinet in the tool shed, which I had always kept locked, not because I was hiding anything, but because 30 years of electrical paperwork and property records take up space, and I preferred to keep them organized in a place where they would not be disturbed. Grant had not attempted to access the filing cabinet. I believe it did not occur to him that it existed, or that if it existed, it would contain anything important, which is its own kind of statement about what he thought he knew about how I had operated for 30 years. I found the original deed. I found the mortgage documents from the 2 refinancings. I found the permits for every major construction phase, the addition, the workshop, the garage, the back bedroom. I found the insurance policies and the service contracts and the repair records going back to the mid-90s. I found everything I had kept because I am a man who keeps things, who understands that the paper record of a thing is as important as the thing itself, because eventually a time comes when someone will ask you to prove what you know, and at that moment the paper is all you have. What I did not find, and what I was looking for, was anything that transferred any form of ownership, interest, or authority that could not be revoked, because I had not signed anything like that. I was certain of it. But I wanted to be certain the way an electrician is certain, not based on memory, but based on having looked directly at the circuit. I was going through the files on a Wednesday evening in late September, the week before the envelope came, when I came across something in the back of the drawer that I did not immediately recognize. It was a sealed envelope, not opened, not addressed to me. My name written on the front in Laurel's handwriting, and below my name one word: when. I held that envelope for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. On the paper in Laurel's handwriting it said, "Call Joanne Whitaker." Her number was below. Below the number Laurel had written, "I built something for you the same way you built everything for us. Use it when you need it. I love you, Raymond. I always will." I sat in the tool shed for a long time that evening. The Oklahoma night came through the window the way it always does, and I held that piece of paper in my hands, and something happened in my chest that I am not going to try to describe because language is not adequate to it. I will just say that for the first time in a long time, I did not feel entirely alone in what I was doing. I called Joanne Whitaker the following morning. She knew who I was before I identified myself. She said, "Raymond Calder," she said, "I have been waiting for this call for about 3 years. She said, Laurel told me you would know when to make it because you were that kind of man, meaning the kind who waits until he is certain. I told her I was not certain yet. She said that was all right. She said, come in and let me show you something, and we will figure out together what certain looks like. Before I tell you what Joanne showed me, I want to pause here one more time, because the thing I am about to describe is the thing that changed everything, and I want you to be ready for it. Tell me where you are watching from. Your city, your state. Drop it in the comments below. And if you have been in a situation where someone was slowly, carefully, quietly rearranging your life while you were too occupied with grief to see it, leave a comment because you're not alone and you are not imagining it. Hit the like button if this story is staying with you. Subscribe for daily stories. And now let me tell you what Laurel built for me 3 years before she needed to. The week before the envelope arrived, I sat across from Joanne Whitaker in her office on the 11th floor of a building on South Boston Avenue, and she opened a manila folder and put a document in front of me and explained, in her unhurried professional way, what it said and what it meant. She walked me through every provision. She explained the administrative authorization, which was completely standard and recoverable. She explained the limits of that authorization, which were clear and specific, and she explained the clause about rent, which Laurel had requested specifically and which Joanne had drafted with care. No authorized family member may charge Raymond Calder, at any time, in any amount, under any description, for the occupancy of any room or portion of the property located at 2148 South Yorktown Avenue. Any documented evidence of such a charge, including any receipt, invoice, agreement, or written acknowledgement bearing the signature of an authorized family member, constitutes an automatic revocation of that member's administrative authority. I read it twice. Then I looked up at Joanne, and I said, Laurel wrote this. She said Laurel requested it specifically. She said she would like me to tell you one more thing, which is that when your wife came to see me the second time to review the final document, she said she hoped you would never need it. She said she genuinely believed Grant would grow into the kind of man who understood what his father had built. She said she just wanted to make sure that if he did not, you had something to stand on. I drove home that day along Riverside Drive, the way I sometimes go when I need the longer route, the route that takes you along the Arkansas River where the light comes off the water in the afternoon in a way that Laurel always loved. I drove slowly. I was thinking about my wife, about the particular practical love she had shown me her entire life, and about the week that was coming, and about an envelope that had been slid under the door of a room that my hands had built. I knew what was going to happen now. Not all of it, but the shape of it. The way an electrician knows the shape of a circuit before he follows it all the way to the source, because he understands the system well enough to know where the path has to lead. The Tuesday morning came. The envelope came with it, and when I read Grant's note for the second time, folded it back into the envelope and sat on the edge of that estate sale bed in the back bedroom of my house, I was not defeated. I was not confused. I was not wondering if I was wrong about what I had seen or felt or lived through for the past year. I was waiting. The way a man who understands systems waits, which is to say patiently and completely and without any doubt about what comes next. Friday was 4 days away. Friday was when the rent was due. And Friday was when my son was going to sign a piece of paper that he thought proved I had accepted his terms. He had no way of knowing that Laurel had already decided what that signature meant. There are 4 days between a Tuesday and a Friday that feel like nothing when you are busy, and feel like a century when you are carrying something that cannot be put down. I carried the knowledge of the covenant the way I used to carry a difficult job through a long week when I was still working full-time at Western Electrical. You do not think about it constantly. Thinking about it constantly would make you useless. You put it in a specific place in your mind, a place that is accessible but not intrusive, and you go about the ordinary business of being alive, and every so often you check the place where you put it and confirm it is still there and still solid, and then you go back to the ordinary business. The ordinary business that week was the same as it had always been in the house on Yorktown Avenue, which is to say it was the business of living quietly in the back bedroom of a home that no longer felt like mine, and doing so without letting the quality of my discomfort show in a way that would give Grant any reason to adjust his behavior before Friday. This was the part that required the most discipline. I want to be honest with you about something that I have not said out loud before, which is that the hardest part of that week was not the anger. I had found a way to hold the anger at a distance by then, not because it was not real, but because I am a man who learned a long time ago that anger is an energy, and energy directed badly is energy wasted, and I could not afford to waste anything in those 4 days. The hardest part was the love. I still loved my son. I want to be clear about that because if I am not clear about it, the story becomes something simpler than it actually was, and simpler stories are easier to tell, but they are not always honest. Grant Calder is my son. He has been my son for 36 years. I was in the room when he was born. I taught him to ride a bicycle in the driveway of the house on Yorktown Avenue on a Saturday morning in September of 1992. I helped him move into his first apartment. I sat with him the night his first serious relationship ended, and he did not know what to do with how bad it felt. I walked him down the aisle at his wedding, which is not a traditional thing for a father to do, but Marissa's father was not in her life, and she asked if I would walk beside Grant so she would have a father on each side of her. And I did, and I was glad to. He is my son. The envelope under the door was real, and the love was also real, and both of those things were true at the same time, and living inside both of them simultaneously for 4 days was the specific work of that week. Wednesday morning I took my usual walk, down Yorktown to the end of the block, east on 21st Street, back up Hudson past Calvin's house. Calvin was in his front yard when I came by, working on something at the end of his driveway, and he raised a hand when he saw me, and I raised a hand back and kept walking. That is how Calvin and I communicate sometimes. We have been friends long enough that a raised hand can contain a whole conversation about how a man is doing, and what he needs, and whether he needs anything at all right now, or just the acknowledgement that someone sees him. I passed the old house on the corner of Hudson and 22nd that has been in the same family since before I moved into the neighborhood, and whose front porch I have always liked for reasons I cannot fully explain. There is something in the particular way that porch sits on that house that looks like it was built by someone who understood what a porch is for, which is to say someone who believed that the space between the inside of a house and the rest of the world deserved careful attention. I thought about Laurel the whole walk. I thought about her specifically in the way I think about her now, which is different from how I thought about her in the first year after she was gone. In the first year the thinking was mostly grief, mostly the presence of absence, mostly the particular silence of a life that used to have a specific voice in it. Now the thinking is more like conversation. I think something, and then I think what she would have said about it, and sometimes I know exactly what she would have said, and sometimes I do not know, but I know the shape of how she would have said it, the particular practical gentleness that was entirely her own. She would have told me not to be dramatic about Friday. She would have told me to eat something before I went. She would have told me to be fair to Grant even while I was holding him accountable, which is a distinction that matters to me and that I am going to try to honor in the way I tell this part of the story. On Thursday, I called Joanne to confirm the meeting for Saturday morning. She said she would be there. She said she would bring the original document and the notarized copies and her own notes. She said, "Raymond, are you doing all right?" And I said, "I am doing all right," which was approximately true. She said, "Call me if anything changes before Saturday." I said I would. I also called Elaine Thursday evening. Elaine Porter, my sister, 62 years old, who has lived in Tulsa her whole life except for the 4 years she spent at the University of Oklahoma studying education. She teaches 3rd grade. She has taught 3rd grade for 35 years. She is the most patient person I have ever met in my life, which I attribute to spending 35 years in a room with 8-year-olds, and she has the particular quality of a person who has spent decades making complicated things comprehensible to people who do not yet have the tools to understand them, which means she can make complicated things comprehensible to anyone. I told Elaine what was happening. I had not told her before, partly because I was not yet certain what I was going to do, and partly because Elaine has a protective instinct that operates faster than her judgment, meaning her first response to hearing that someone has hurt her brother tends to be emotional before it is strategic, and in this situation I needed her strategic before I needed her emotional. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Raymond, how long has this been going on?" I told her approximately a year. She was quiet again. Then she said, "Why did you not tell me sooner?" I said, "Because I was figuring it out." She said, "That is the most you thing I have ever heard." Then she said, "What do you need from me Saturday?" I told her I needed her there as a witness, not as an advocate, and I needed her to let me run the conversation and not step in unless I asked her to. She said, "I can do that." She said, "I will be there at 9:15. Then she said, "Raymond, Mom always said you were the patient one and Dad was the stubborn one." She said, "I think she was wrong. I think you have both and you just took longer to need both at the same time." I slept surprisingly well Thursday night, not because the anxiety was gone, but because I had done the preparation that was available to me to do, and there was nothing left to accomplish until Friday afternoon. And a man who has worked with his hands his whole life understands the particular piece of having done what can be done and waiting for the moment that comes next. You cannot rush a joint cure. You cannot hurry a circuit test. You put in the work, and you wait, and the work either holds or it does not. Friday arrived the way all important days arrive, which is to say, completely ordinarily. The October light came through the window of the back bedroom the same way it comes through every morning at that time of year in Tulsa, warm and slightly sideways, the kind of light that makes the dust visible in a room and makes the room look older and more permanent than it does in the flat light of midday. I lay in bed for a while, listening to the house. Grant and Marissa were up. I could hear the coffee maker and the particular sound of the kitchen being used by people who feel at home in it, which is a sound that used to be the first sound of my morning for 3 decades and which now reached me through a closed door. I want to stop here for just a moment. I need to step out of that Friday for a second and ask you something, because I have been getting deeper into this story and I realize I have not checked in with you in a while. Where are you watching from right now? What city are you in? What state? Drop it in the comments below. And if this story has made you think of someone, a parent, a family member, someone who gave everything they had and then found themselves in a situation where that giving was taken for granted, leave a comment about that. I read everyone. Hit the like button if you are still with me. Subscribe if you want to hear how Friday goes, because it is going to go in a direction that Grant did not see coming. New story here every single day. Now let me tell you about the most important transaction of my life. I spent the morning quietly. I had coffee that I'd made in the small coffee maker I kept in the back bedroom because making coffee in the kitchen had started to feel like an intrusion into a space that should have been mine without question. I looked out the window at the yard. The tool shed was visible from that window and I looked at it for a while, at the patched roof that Calvin and I had repaired 2 summers ago, at the familiar silhouette of a structure I had built over the course of a single fall, working every weekend from September to December. At 2:30 in the afternoon I counted out the rent money. I want to describe this scene carefully, because it matters, and because the way I did it was deliberate. I went to the small safe in the closet of the back bedroom, the same safe I have had for 20 years, the one where I keep documents and the cash I maintain for emergencies and certain things that belong only to me. I counted out the amount Grant had written on the paper. It was not a large amount, which made it more insulting in its own way, not less. The amount did not matter. The principle was the thing. The principle was my son. Standing in the administrative position I had granted him out of grief and love and temporary incapacity, reaching down to the room I built in the summer of 1997 and telling me to pay for it or leave. I counted the bills. I folded them. I put them in a plain brown envelope, the kind I keep in the desk in the back bedroom for correspondence. And I sealed the envelope, and I wrote nothing on the outside of it. Then I walked down the short hallway from the back bedroom to the kitchen, where Grant was sitting at the table with his laptop open and a cup of coffee at his right hand, and I put the envelope on the table in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at me. Something moved in his face that was not quite surprise, but was close to it. I think he had expected me to argue. I think he had expected the conversation he had prepared for, the one where I said, "This is not right," and he had his response ready, and we went back and forth until he said something about how these were the new terms, and I was welcome to find other arrangements. He had not prepared for silence and an envelope. I said, "I have the rent." He picked up the envelope. He opened it. He counted the bills, not because he doubted the amount, but because it gave him something to do with his hands while he recalibrated. Then he set the bills on the table, and he said, "Fine." He said, "This is how it works now, Dad." He said, "I am glad you understand that." I said, "I need a receipt." He looked at me then. A different look. Something between confusion and the beginning of wariness, though he did not know what he was wary of yet. He said, "What do you mean you need a receipt?" I said, "I am a tenant now, Grant. Tenants get receipts." He seemed to consider this and find it reasonable, or at least not unreasonable, and he reached for a notepad on the counter. He wrote, "Rent paid in full for back room." He signed his name underneath, Grant Calder. His signature is large and forward-leaning, the signature of a man who considers himself a person of consequence, and he wrote it without pausing and handed the notepad page to me. I took it. I folded it once. I put it in the breast pocket of my shirt and I held it there for a moment, my hand flat over it. Then I said, "Thank you, son. I needed your signature more than you needed my money." He looked at me for a long moment. Something in my face told him that sentence meant more than the words on the surface, but he could not have told you what it meant, because he did not know what I knew, because he did not know about Joanne Whitaker or the covenant, or the sealed envelope in the tool shed filing cabinet, or the Tuesday when his mother sat across from a records consultant and quietly, lovingly, built a firewall between her husband's generosity and the world's appetite for it. He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "I will see you Saturday morning. I would like you and Marissa to be at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock. Elaine will be there. We are going to have a conversation that is overdue." Then I walked back down the short hallway to the back bedroom, and I closed the door behind me, and I sat on the edge of the estate sale bed, and I held the folded receipt in my hand, and I looked at the window, and I breathed. Outside, the October evening was beginning the way October evenings begin in Tulsa when the season has properly turned. The sky was going that particular shade of orange and rose that the dust in Oklahoma air produces at sunset, a color Laurel always called impossible, meaning it looked like something someone had made up. The crickets were starting up. A car moved slowly down Yorktown Avenue with its windows down. I thought, "Laurel, you built this. You built it 3 years before it was needed, and you put it where I would find it when I was ready for it. And you were right about when I would be ready because you always were. And I am going to walk through what you built for me on Saturday morning, and I am going to do it in the way you would want me to do it, which is to say, without cruelty and without drama and with the particular steadiness of a man who understands systems and knows where the wire leads." I put the receipt in the small safe in the closet. Then I got up and went to the kitchen and made myself a real dinner for the first time in 2 weeks, using my own kitchen without asking permission, because the transaction that gave the safe its meaning had been completed, and there was a version of the future available to me now that had not been available that morning, and that future deserved to be greeted with something more substantial than another meal eaten on a tray in the back bedroom. Saturday was 24 hours away. I had not felt this much like myself in over a year. Now let me take you forward into Friday night, because Friday night is where I need to tell you about Calvin, because Calvin is a part of this story that I have not yet fully described, and Calvin deserves to be fully described. Calvin Brooks is 67 years old, and he has the hands of a man who has spent his entire working life in physical labor, wide and thick, and permanently darkened in the creases in a way that no amount of washing ever entirely addresses. He has been a mason since his mid-teens, when his father put a trowel in his hand and told him that a man who can build something from raw material will never be without work, and he has proven this true every year of his life since. He built things all over Tulsa for 40 years, and he is still called occasionally for consultation on historic restoration projects, because there are techniques he knows that fewer and fewer people know anymore. Techniques for working with old brick and old mortar and old structures that require a different approach than new construction. He came by Friday evening at around 7:30. He knocked on the side door, the door that opens to the driveway, and the path to the tool shed, which is where people who know the house well always knock, and I let him in, and we went and sat in the tool shed the way we sometimes do, on the stools and the old lawn chair that I keep in there, with the door open and the October night coming in. I told him what I had done. I told him about the covenant. I told him about Joanne Whitaker and the sealed envelope in the filing cabinet and the receipt that was now in the safe. I told him all of it. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. Calvin handles information the way he handles material. He takes it in and he feels the weight of it before he responds, and the quality of his silence is never empty. Then he said Laurel was something else. I said she was. He said she saw this coming 3 years ago. I said she saw me coming 3 years ago. She knew I would need the documentation because she knew I would not fight for myself the way I would fight for someone else, and so she built the fight for me in advance and left it in a drawer. He said, "You are going to be all right, Raymond." I said, "I know that." He said, "Do you need me there Saturday?" I thought about it. I said I would like you there, not inside, just nearby. He said he would be on the porch at 9:45. I said that was fine. He said he would bring coffee. I said that was also fine. We sat for a while after that without talking, which is one of the things I value most about Calvin's company. We watched the toolshed night, which is its own particular night, the way the orange streetlight from Yorktown falls through the small window on the north wall and puts a stripe of light across the concrete floor among all the familiar shapes of tools that I have accumulated over 30 years, and that are arranged in the specific order that I arranged them, and that still makes sense to me when I reach for any of them in the dark. He left around 9. I stayed in the tool shed a while longer. Then I went to bed. I slept the whole night. The morning of Saturday, the 15th of October, came in clean and cold by the standards of an Oklahoma autumn, which means it was somewhere in the upper 50s when I got up at 6:30, the particular temperature at which the air smells like wood smoke and something ending, the seasonal turn made physical and olfactory. I had my coffee standing at the window of the back bedroom. The yard was in the early morning light, the grass still holding a little of the previous night's cold on its surface, the tool shed casting its familiar shadow toward the east. I drank the coffee slowly. I was not anxious. I want to be precise about this because anxiety would be the expected thing, and what I actually felt was something different from anxiety. What I felt was a particular focused clarity, the specific state of a man who has traced a circuit all the way back to its source and understands exactly what he is looking at and exactly what needs to happen next. I dressed carefully, not formally, not in the way that would have announced itself as an event. Dark trousers, a buttoned shirt, blue, the color Laurel always said made my eyes look like they knew something. Work boots because I am a man who wears work boots, and this Saturday was not an exception to that. I looked at myself in the small mirror on the back of the closet door. the mirror that has been in that room since 1997, and I saw a man who was 58 years old and had the face of someone who had been through a hard year, but had come through it with something still intact, the particular thing that you cannot quite name, but that other people register when they look at you, the quality of a person who has not been broken by what tried to break them. I thought of Laurel saying that blue shirt made my eyes look like they knew something. I said out loud to the empty room, "I know something this morning, Laurel. I know quite a bit." I went to the safe in the closet and took out the receipt. I put it in the breast pocket of my shirt. I had left it in the safe all week, checking it once on Thursday morning to confirm it was still there and still legible and still bearing Grant's large forward-leaning signature in the exact form that made it what it was. It was. I put it back, and now I put it in my pocket, and I felt the slight weight of it there against my chest, the weight of a single folded piece of notebook paper that weighed nothing and weighed everything. At 9:15 I went to the kitchen and put a full pot of coffee on. The good coffee, the kind I buy at the grocery store on 36th Street, rather than the standard kind I usually keep in the back bedroom. The kind Laurel used on mornings when she considered the morning worth commemorating. I set out cups. I set out the creamer. I set the table with 4 places the way I used to set it when we were a family sitting down to something together. At 9:25, Elaine arrived. She came through the front door, which I had unlocked for her at 9, and she walked through the living room into the kitchen, and she looked at the table and she looked at me, and she put her hand on my arm for a moment without saying anything. Then she poured herself a coffee and sat down in the chair that had always been her chair when she came to Sunday dinner, the chair to my left with the view of the backyard and the tool shed. At 9:45, Calvin appeared on the back porch as promised, with a travel cup of coffee in his hand. He settled into the porch chair nearest the door and looked out at the yard, and made himself the kind of present that only a man of his particular quality knows how to be, which is to say completely available and completely unobtrusive at the same time. At 10 minutes to 10, I heard movement in the master bedroom. Grant and Marissa. The sounds of 2 people who have been informed that something is happening and have not been told what, preparing themselves for a conversation they cannot prepare for because they do not have the relevant information. Grant came into the kitchen first. He was wearing weekend clothes, jeans and a fleece, the casual of someone who had expected a manageable conversation. Marissa came behind him. She saw Elaine at the table, and something shifted in her expression. A small recalibration, the way a person recalibrates when a situation is slightly more formal than they anticipated. Grant looked at the table, 4 cups set out. He looked at me. He said morning. I said good morning, Grant. Sit down, please. He looked at Elaine again, measuring the significance of her presence. Then he sat down. Marissa sat beside him. I poured coffee. I set the pot in the center of the table. I said, "I want to start by telling you both that I love you. I want that to be the first thing said in this room this morning because I want it to be the context for everything else. I am not here to attack you. I am here to tell you something that I should have said much sooner, and the reason I did not say it sooner is that I was not ready. And the reason I was not ready is that I am still a man who believes in giving people the benefit of the doubt, even past the point where the doubt is no longer reasonable." Grant looked at his coffee cup. Marissa looked at me. I said, 3 months ago, I moved into the back bedroom of this house, a house that I built over 12 years, because you told me it would be temporary while you were here. It was not temporary. The back bedroom became my room in my own house. You and Marissa moved into the master bedroom and stayed there. You took over the accounts and the correspondence and the schedule. You converted Laurel's office without asking me whether it was the right thing to do. You arranged things so that I was asking permission to use my own kitchen. And then, on the 11th of October, you put an envelope under the door of the room I built in 1997, and you told me to pay rent for it or get out by Friday. No one spoke. I said, "I want to ask you something, Grant. Not rhetorically. I want you to actually answer it. When you wrote that note, what did you think it would feel like to me to read it?" Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, it was a practical matter." He said, "The house has expenses. He said everyone who uses a resource needs to contribute to its maintenance. He said he had not intended it to be cruel. He said it was just how things work. I said, I understand that is how you framed it to yourself. I want you to hear what you actually did. You charged me rent on a room in a house that I built with my own hands, in a house that you grew up in a house that your mother chose the colors for, and your father laid the brick for, and your father paid the mortgage on for 28 years. You charged me rent, and then you had me sign a piece of paper acknowledging that I had paid it. Marissa said, Raymond, we thought you understood the new arrangement. I said, I understood more than you know, Marissa. And then I reached into the breast pocket of my shirt and I took out the receipt. I unfolded it, and I placed it in the center of the kitchen table, face up in the space between the 4 coffee cups, on the table that Laurel had found at a garage sale in 1991, the table with the slight warp in the 4th board from the left edge. Let me stop here. I need to stop here. Because what I am about to describe is the moment that everything changed, and I want to make sure you are with me for it. Where are you watching from right now? What city? What state? Drop it in the comments. If you have been holding your breath through this story the way I held myself together through that week, let me know in the comments. Hit that like button. Subscribe for daily stories because there is a new one every single day. And what I am about to describe is the reason Laurel Calder was the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Now let me finish this. Joanne Whitaker arrived at the front door at precisely 10 past 10. I had asked her to wait until the conversation had started, until the receipt was on the table, until Grant and Marissa had seen it and understood what they were looking at, but not yet what it meant. I had asked for that specific timing deliberately. I wanted them to see the receipt first, without the explanation, so that they would have a moment in which they might think about what they had done independently before the consequence arrived. Elaine let Joanne in. She came into the kitchen carrying a flat folder, the color of old manila, unremarkable, the kind of folder that could contain a grocery list or a contract or the document that Laurel Calder had signed in a lawyer's office 3 years before she died in order to protect her husband from the consequences of his own generous heart. Joanne set the folder on the table beside the receipt. She said good morning. She introduced herself to Grant and Marissa. She said her name and her occupation, and she said she had worked with Raymond's wife, Laurel, on a matter she was here to explain. Grant looked at the folder. He looked at me. He said, "What is this?" I said, "This is something your mother built." Joanne opened the folder. She placed the covenant on the table. She did not read it aloud in its entirety. She explained it. She was clear and unhurried and completely precise, which is the only way she does anything. And she explained what the document said and what the document meant and why it existed, and when it had been created, and what the specific clause about rent meant in the context of the receipt that was already on the table. Grant's face changed while she was talking. It did not change all at once. It changed in stages, the way a structure changes when load is removed from it, settling and shifting in sequence. First, there was the disbelief, the reflexive pushing back that happens when information conflicts with what a person believed was true. Then there was the beginning of understanding, the moment when the specific and concrete language of the document made the disbelief untenable. Then there was something that I am going to call the recognition, the moment when Grant understood not just what the document said, but what his signature on the receipt meant, what the combination of the two meant, and what he had done by writing that note and sliding it under a door and signing his name on a piece of notebook paper without reading it carefully. Marissa had gone pale. She was holding her coffee cup but not drinking from it. When Joanne finished speaking, the kitchen was quiet. Grant said, "That cannot be enforceable." Joanne said, "I am not an attorney, and this is not a legal opinion. What I can tell you is that the document was properly prepared, properly witnessed, and properly notarized. The language is specific and clear. Whether enforcement requires legal proceedings or not is a question for your respective attorneys. But the document exists and the receipt exists, and the two of them together say exactly what they say." Grant said, "Mom did this." I said 3 years before she died. She did it because she knew me, Grant. She knew I would let this happen the way it happened because I love you, and I have spent my whole life trusting the people I love more than I trust my own needs. She knew she needed to build something that would still be standing after she was gone. That is what she did. That is who she was. Grant looked at the table. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the receipt with his signature on it. He looked at the covenant with his mother's name on it. He looked at none of these things for very long, the way you look away from something when it shows you something about yourself that you are not ready to see clearly. Marissa said quietly, "Grant." He did not respond. I said, "I am not here to destroy you. That is important for you to hear and for you to believe. I am not doing this to punish you. I am doing this because I am 58 years old and I built this house and I have a right to live in it as the man who built it, not as a tenant in the room in the back. And because your mother asked me, a long time ago without my knowledge, to stand up for that when the time came, I said, I am asking you and Marissa to find another place to live. I am giving you 30 days. I am asking you to take that time, find something suitable, and transition out of this house with your dignity intact. I do not want drama. I do not want a confrontation with the neighbors on the porch or a scene in the driveway. You will have 30 days and a father who is asking you to use them well." Grant finally looked up. His face had gone through several things by then, and what was left on it was not the confident administrative efficiency of the man who had put an envelope under a door. What was left was something younger and more confused, something that I recognized from 36 years ago. The face of a person who has done something that they did not fully understand until after they had done it. He said, "Dad." I said, "I know, son." He said, "I did not think of it as." I said, "I know." He stopped. He did not finish the sentence. I do not think he could have finished it in a way that was honest and also bearable. Marissa said, "We will be out in 30 days. I said, "Thank you." Joanne closed the folder. She said she would be in touch regarding the administrative transfer of accounts and correspondence, and she would need Grant's cooperation in that process and expected to have it. Grant nodded. He was still looking at his hands. Elaine had not said a word the entire time. She sat to my left with her coffee cup and her third-grade teacher's patience, and she watched her brother do the hardest thing he had done in a year without interfering, which was what I had asked of her, and which I suspect cost her considerably. I looked at her after Joanne finished, and she looked at me, and she gave me a small nod, the kind that means I see you, and you did well. And now it is done. I stood up. I picked up the receipt from the center of the table. I put it back in my breast pocket. I would not be leaving it on the table, not as a statement, not as a monument to what had just happened. It had done what it needed to do. It had served the purpose that Laurel's covenant had always intended it to serve. It was mine now, and it would go back into the safe, and eventually it would find a more permanent home, and I would know what that home was when the time came. I said, "I am going to take a walk. When I come back, I would like to use my kitchen without it being an event. I would like to have my coffee at my table. I would like to look out the back window at my yard and my tool shed and feel that I am in a place that I built, that belongs to me, and that I am welcome in. I would like that to begin today." Nobody said anything. I walked through the kitchen, through the living room with its new pillows and its new rug, through the front door and down the steps of the porch on the front of the house at 2148 South Yorktown Avenue, the porch whose every board I knew and whose every support beam I had checked and resecured 3 times over 30 years, and I stood on the sidewalk in the October morning and breathed the cold, clean air. Calvin was still on the back porch. He would hear, eventually, how it had gone. He would come around the side of the house when he heard the front door, and he would look at me and read whatever was on my face, and he would know. He knew me that way. He had known me that way since the year we met at church in 1989. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Down Yorktown Avenue, the neighborhood was doing its Saturday morning things. A man walking a dog, a car pulling out of a driveway. leaves beginning to come down from the trees in the light wind that was coming from the northwest. The sky was that particular flat blue that Oklahoma makes in October, the blue that has no haze in it, the blue that looks like it goes straight to space without anything in between. I thought about Laurel. I thought about her sitting across from Joanne Whitaker with a legal pad and a pen, and a clear-eyed understanding of who I was and what I needed and what the future was going to require of both of us. I thought about her looking at that document before she signed it, reading every word the way she read everything, all the way through and then back through again to make sure she had understood it correctly. I thought about her putting it in a sealed envelope and writing my name on the front and the single word, "when" below it, and filing it in the back of a drawer in a toolshed filing cabinet where she knew I would eventually find it when I was ready to find it. I thought about all of it, and I felt something that was not exactly happiness, because happiness is too simple a word for what a man feels when he has been through what I had been through, but something adjacent to it. Something in the neighborhood of peace, something that felt like being exactly where I was supposed to be, standing on the sidewalk in front of my house in the October morning, with the receipt of my son's signature in my pocket, and the covenant of my wife's love in a folder on the kitchen table, and 31 years of Tulsa autumn in my lungs. I turned around. I walked back up the path to the front door. I went inside. I went to the kitchen. I poured myself a cup of coffee, and I sat down in my chair, the one at the head of the table, the one I had sat in for 30 years, and I looked out the window at the backyard and the tool shed, and I drank my coffee. It tasted like the first cup of coffee I had made in my own house in over a year. Because it was. The 30 days that followed the Saturday morning at the kitchen table were not easy days. I want to be honest about that because the story is not useful if I tell it as though resolution arrived cleanly and completely the moment the receipt was placed on the table and the covenant was explained. Resolution of that kind only exists in the version of things we tell ourselves when we want the narrative to be neater than the experience actually was. What arrived on that Saturday was a beginning, a specific and necessary beginning, but a beginning nonetheless, with all the difficulty and the uncertainty and the particular emotional weight that beginnings carry when they are also endings of something else. Grant and Marissa moved through the house in the days that followed the way two people move through a space when they understand that the space is no longer theirs, which is to say, carefully and quietly, and with a kind of deliberateness that is different from the deliberateness of people who feel at home somewhere. They were not hostile. I want to be clear about this. There was no scene in the driveway. There was no confrontation on the porch. There were no slammed doors or raised voices or anything that would have made the neighbors stop and look. Marissa had said we will be out in 30 days, and she was a woman who meant what she said. And Grant, for his part, appeared to be in the particular state of a person who is processing something large and slow and has not yet found the words for what he is processing. I gave them the space to process it. I did not hover. I did not monitor. I went about the business of reclaiming my house in the small and specific ways that matter to a man who has lived in a place for 31 years and knows exactly where every piece of himself belongs. On the Sunday morning after the Saturday, I moved my coffee back to the cabinet it had been in for a decade. It sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. It was the first thing. On the following Tuesday, I went into Laurel's office. The room that had been Laurel's office. The room that was now Grant's home office, with his desk and his equipment and his filing system installed in it. I did not go in to inspect or to catalog or to begin any process of reclamation. I went in, and I stood in the doorway for a long time, and I looked at the room and I thought about what it had been, and what it had become, and what it was going to be again. The room was approximately 14 feet by 11 feet. It had a single window that looked out toward the north side of the yard. In the years when it was Laurel's room, it had a reading chair in the corner near that window, an old chair she had reupholstered herself using fabric she bought at a shop on Peoria Avenue, a fabric with small blue flowers on a cream background. The chair was in storage. The fabric was probably still fine. The window still let in the same northern light it had always let in, the light that does not change with the season the way southern light does, the steady indirect light that is best for reading, and for the particular kind of thinking that happens in a quiet room when a person is not required to perform themselves for anyone. I thought, this room is going to be her room again. Not exactly. Not as it was. She is not here to sit in the chair, and I cannot make her be here by arranging the room as though she is. But the room can be what it was. A quiet place, a reading place, a place that holds the particular atmosphere of a person who valued thought and solitude and the specific pleasure of spending an afternoon with a book while the house sounds went on around her. That was what I decided standing in the doorway. Not loudly, not as a declaration. Just a quiet decision made by a man in his own house, looking at a room, understanding what he was going to do with it. I stepped back out and closed the door gently. Calvin came by on the Wednesday of the first week. He came to the side door as he always does, and I let him in, and we had coffee at the kitchen table, the real kitchen table with the warp in the fourth board and the 30 years of meals on its surface, and we talked for a while about things that were not directly about what had happened, which is the Calvin Brooks way of being there for a person without making the person feel like a subject being studied. He asked after a while how Grant was doing. I said I did not entirely know. I said Grant was moving through the house like a man who was trying to understand something that did not yet have clear edges for him. Calvin nodded and said that sounded about right. He said, "Raymond, do you remember the first wall we built on this house?" I said I remembered it like this morning. He said, "Do you remember what you did wrong?" I said I remembered that too. I had been in too much of a hurry on the first course and had not checked the level carefully enough, and we had to take out 2 complete courses and start them again. Calvin said, "And what did you do when you had to take them out?" I said I took them out and started again. He said exactly. He said some men would have left those 2 courses and built the rest on top and told themselves it was close enough. He said you were not that man. He said maybe Grant has some of that in him, and maybe this is the part where he finds out. I thought about that for a while after Calvin left. I thought about whether Grant had any of that in him, the willingness to take down what was wrong and start it again correctly, rather than build on top of a flawed foundation and hope it held. I did not know the answer. I still do not know the full answer. But what happened in the 3rd week of those 30 days gave me reason to believe the question was not without hope. I need to tell you about the tool shed. On the afternoon of the 21st day, a Thursday, I was in the tool shed doing maintenance on some of the hand tools I had not had occasion to use in a while. Cleaning, sharpening, checking handles for cracks, the ordinary stewardship of things that have served you well and deserve the return of attention. I had the radio going softly, the country station out of Tulsa that plays the older material in the afternoons, and the side door of the tool shed was open to the October air, which by the 3rd week of the month had gotten properly cold, the kind of cold that made the air smell like the end of something. Grant appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment without saying anything. He was wearing work clothes, not the weekend casual, actual work clothes, jeans that were not clean jeans, and an old flannel shirt. He was holding something in both hands. It was a brick, not a new brick, an old one, the color of the bricks I had used on the back exterior wall in the summer of 1997, the particular Oklahoma clay red that weathers to something slightly darker and richer over 30 years. He was holding it the way a person holds something when they are not sure what to do with it, carefully, with both hands, the weight of it evident. He said, "I found these in the storage area, a whole row of them. They have dates written on them." I set down the tool I was working on. I said, "Your mother wrote those. Every major section of this house has a corresponding brick in that row, the date the foundation was poured, the date the first wall went up, the date the back bedroom was finished. She started doing it when we were about 3 years in. She said she wanted a record that was physical, not just on paper." He looked at the brick in his hands. He turned it over. On the side that had been face down, in Laurel's handwriting in permanent marker, it said, "Back bedroom exterior wall complete. July 12, 1997. Grant is 9 years old today." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She wrote my age on it." I said, "She wrote your age on all of them. Every brick has the date and how old you were." He looked up from the brick. His face was doing something that I'm not going to try to describe in detail, because some things that happen on a person's face belong to them and not to the story. But I will say that it was the face of a man who had just understood something about his own history that he had not understood before. Something about the way a life is built and what it costs to build it, and who was present for every stage of the building and what that presence means. He said quietly, "Dad, I did not know what I was doing." I said, "I know that, son." He said, "I told myself it was practical. I told myself you needed structure and I was providing it. I told myself." I said, "Grant." He stopped. I said, "A man can tell himself a lot of things. The question is whether he stops when the telling stops being true." He held the brick for another long moment. Then he said, "Can I help you with something? In here, today, whatever you are working on." I looked at him. I looked at the flannel shirt and the work jeans and the brick in his hands and the particular expression of a man who is asking for something that is not the thing he appears to be asking for. He was asking to work alongside me. He was asking to be in this space that had always been my space and to do something with his hands in it and to be near me while he did. I said, "Pull up that stool. I will show you what I am doing." He pulled up the stool. He set the brick down on the workbench. I handed him a sharpening stone and a draw knife, and I showed him what he was looking for, what dull looked like and what sharp looked like, and how you could tell the difference without cutting yourself to test it. He worked slowly at first, uncertain of the angle and the pressure, and I corrected him twice, and by the end of the afternoon he was doing it adequately. Not well, but adequately, with the particular careful attention of someone who is learning something for the first time and understands that learning it correctly is more important than learning it fast. I look at both of them when I am in the tool shed working. I do not look at them every time. I do not need to, but sometimes I look at them and I think about the specific relationship between those two objects, a son's signature and a mother's photograph, and I think about the covenant that connects them. And I think that Laurel Calder was the most sophisticated builder I have ever known in my life, and I built things with my hands for 30 years. What she built was invisible and structural and completely load-bearing. What she built was the safety that a man needs when the people he loves are not able, in that moment, to be what he needs them to be. She built it in an office on South Boston Avenue on a Wednesday morning while I was at work, and she filed it with a woman named Joanne Whitaker, and she wrote my name on an envelope and a single word below it, and she put it where she knew I would eventually look. The love in that act is not a sentimental love. It is the engineering love of a person who sees clearly and plans accordingly and builds for the future that is coming, even when the future is not yet visible. It is the love that says, "I know you and I know what you will need, and I am going to make sure it is there, even when I cannot be there, to hand it to you directly." I am going to tell you something now that I mean entirely. In 58 years of living, I have received many gifts. I have been given things that cost money and things that cost time and things that cost effort. But the sealed envelope in the back of the filing cabinet in the tool shed on Yorktown Avenue is the most significant gift I have ever received, and it cost Laurel Calder exactly the thing that she understood better than almost anyone else in my life, which is to say it cost her careful attention to who I actually was, rather than who was convenient for me to be. She paid attention for 30 years, and then she paid it forward into the future in the form of a notarized document and a handwritten note and a mason's trowel in the photograph beside the frame. I want to stop here, near the end of this story, and speak to you directly, because there are things in this story that belong to you as much as they belong to me, if you have been listening, and I want to make sure I say them clearly before we are done. If you're a man who has built something, I want you to hear this. The building is not just the structure. The building is not just the business or the house or the career or the reputation you made with your hands or your mind or your years. The building is also the legal reality of what you built and who you built it for and what protections exist around it. I am not a lawyer, and I am not a financial advisor, and nothing I am telling you is professional advice of any kind. But I am a man who spent a year in the back bedroom of a house he built because he was too deep in grief to protect what was his, and what I can tell you from that experience is that the documentation matters. The paper matters. The clear record of what belongs to whom and what the terms are and what protects the builder matters, not because you are suspicious of the people around you, but because grief and age and vulnerability are real conditions that reduce a person's capacity to advocate for themselves, and you owe it to yourself to do the paperwork before those conditions arrive. If you have someone like Laurel in your life, someone who sees you more clearly than you see yourself, and who has been quietly building things around you to protect you from your own most dangerous qualities, I want you to tell them, today, what that means to you. Not in general terms, specifically. Tell them the specific thing they built for you. Tell them the specific quality in them that makes the building possible. Tell them you see it. In my experience, the people who do the quiet structural work of loving someone rarely hear enough about what that work accomplishes. If you are watching this and you are in a situation that resembles what I described, if someone has been slowly and patiently rearranging the architecture of your life while you were occupied with something else, I want to say to you carefully and directly, trust what you know. Your experience of what is happening to you is real. The gradual and incremental nature of the thing does not make it less real. It makes it harder to describe and harder for other people to see, but the thing you are living inside is real. Find the documentation, find the paper trail, find the Joanne Whitaker in your life. And do not mistake the patience that is required for the inaction that is destructive. There is a difference between waiting for the right moment and waiting because you are afraid, and the difference matters enormously, and only you can know which one you are doing. If you are a son or a daughter watching this, I want to say something to you that I am not saying as an accusation, because my son is not a monster, and neither, I suspect, are you. I want to say this: ask. Go and ask the person who built the thing you are living inside how they built it. Ask the questions before the answers become painful. Ask while the builder is still there to tell you, while the story is still available to be given rather than excavated. Ask your father how the house was built, or how the business was started, or how the marriage lasted, or how the hard years were navigated, not because the asking will fix everything, but because the asking is the beginning of understanding what the thing actually cost, and understanding what something cost is, how a person begins to understand its value. My son is learning to lay brick in the backyard. It is slow going. He holds the brick wrong at first, every time, and I correct him every time, and he adjusts, and by the end of each Saturday he is doing it a little less wrong than he was at the beginning. That is the only standard of progress that has ever mattered to me in any domain of my life. A little less wrong than you were before. A little more right than you were yesterday. The brick laid correctly even when no one is watching, because the wall it goes into will be standing long after you are gone. That is what my wife built for 30 years. That is what I tried to build for 30 years. That is what I hope, in whatever portion of this story reaches him, my son is beginning to understand he has the chance to build for himself. Before I go, I want to ask you one final thing, and I want you to know that this request means more to me than you probably realize, because you have given me something tonight by listening. You have given me an audience for a story I carried alone for too long, and I do not take that gift lightly. Leave me a comment with a single word. The word is built, just that word. Nothing else is necessary, though you are welcome to tell me more if you want to. If you truly listened to this story, if you stayed with Raymond Calder from the envelope on the linoleum floor to the tool shed wall where the receipt hangs beside Laurel's photograph, you will understand why that word. You will understand what was built and by whom and at what cost, and what it means that it is still standing. Subscribe if you have not already. There is a new story on this channel every single day, and I am not running out of things to say, not by a long way. Leave a like if this story earned one. And please, If someone in your life needs to hear a story about a man who refused to let what he built be taken from him, share this with them. Not for me, for them. Because sometimes a person needs to hear that holding on is possible before they can believe it is worth it. Let me leave you with the image I carry out of all of this, the one that sits in my mind when I think about what happened on Yorktown Avenue and what it meant. It is an evening in late December. The first real cold of winter has arrived, the kind that comes down from the north across the Oklahoma plains without apology, the kind that makes the stars look closer than they actually are because the air is so clear. I am on the porch of the house at 2148 South Yorktown Avenue. I have a cup of coffee in my hand, the good kind, the kind Laurel used on mornings worth commemorating, and I am drinking it slowly because I have nowhere to be and no reason to hurry, which is the particular luxury of a man who has made his peace with the place he is sitting. The street is quiet. The neighbor's dog made a sound earlier and stopped. A car passed a while ago, and the sound of it has long since faded. The trees are bare, and the streetlight on the corner is putting its orange light across the pavement in the way it has done since the year we moved in, consistent and unhurried, the way a good structural thing does its work, without drama and without ceasing. I can see the tool shed from where I sit. The single window on the north wall is dark from out here, but I know what is on the wall inside that window. I know the frame and the photograph and the handwriting in the margin of a story that almost went differently. I know the covenant in the manila folder in the filing cabinet drawer that my wife placed there for me to find when I was ready to find it. I am sitting on the porch of my house. My house. The house that I laid the first brick of in the spring of 1993, that I finished the back bedroom of in the summer of 1997, that I have repaired and maintained and improved for 31 years, that held our family through every season of the life we made in it. I do not need to ask permission to be here. I do not need to explain my presence. I do not need to listen for sounds in the house before I walk through my own kitchen. I am the man who built this house, and this house knows it, and I know it. And the October and November and December nights have all known it, and the Oklahoma morning will know it again when it comes tomorrow. My son came on Saturday. We worked for 4 hours on the small brick churrasquera he has been building in the corner of the yard, a project he started 3 weeks ago as a way of learning what it actually feels like to do this work, to hold the weight of the brick and feel the mortar give under the trowel and stand back and see whether the thing you built is plumb or not. He held a crooked brick at one point and looked at it and laughed, a short, rueful laugh, and said he had not imagined that something this simple would be this hard. I told him that was the beginning of understanding. I told him the work teaches you things the watching never can. He nodded and tried again with the next brick, more carefully this time, and got it close enough to write that I did not say anything. He asked me before he left that Saturday whether he could come back next week. I said yes. He asked whether there was coffee. I said there was always coffee. He said he would be there at 9. He has been every Saturday since. My son thought he was charging me rent for a room. What he did with that receipt, with the signature on that piece of notebook paper, was confess something he did not know he was confessing. He confessed that he had lived in this house for a year without once understanding what it meant that a man built it. He confessed that he had confused the holding of paperwork with the holding of something real. He confessed that he had looked at 31 years of his father's life and seen administration where he should have seen love. And then, slowly, with brick by crooked brick in the corner of a backyard in Tulsa, Oklahoma, he began to understand the difference. That is the story. That is all of it. And the last thing I want to say, sitting here on this porch with this coffee in this cold, clear Oklahoma night, is something I have been saying in various forms my entire life, but never as clearly as I feel it now. A house is not a building. A house is a record of every decision a person ever made, every shortcut they did not take, every corner they did right even when no one would ever see it, every brick laid plumb even in the dark, every morning they got up and kept going even when they did not entirely want to, every covenant they prepared and sealed and left for the person who would need it, signed with the particular love of a woman who understood that the most powerful thing you can build for someone is not a structure they can live in, but a truth they can stand on. My son thought he was charging me rent for a room. But in that receipt he signed, he confessed he had never understood the difference between living inside a house and honoring the one who raised it. I am still raising it. I will raise it until I cannot. And when that day comes, the walls will still be plumb. Because I checked them, because I always checked them, because that is the only way a man can build anything that lasts.